Why don't we get started? My name is Ken Kahn. I have the honor of serving as Dean of the Montehuja College of Business here at Cleveland State University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our March 10th edition of our Cornerstone Speaker Series. This is a series that we've started to help us connect with the business community and serve as a foundation, or as our vision is about, being a cornerstone for business. So thank you for joining us. Today's topic is about AI and the future of work. Hosting and serving as our moderator is Dr. Charles McElroy, who is a new assistant professor in our Information Systems Department here at Cleveland State's Montehuja College of Business. He has his PhD from Case Western University, and his research actually examines areas of data science, machine learning, and immersive data visualizations. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. McElroy, and very much appreciate him serving as our moderator. Everybody enjoy today's session.
Thank you, Ken, for your kind introduction. I say I'm Charlie McElroy. I'm here at Cleveland State University, and every day I get to do two things that are a lot of fun. One is working with smart and hardworking students, and the other is having really interesting discussions with experts in their field. And I think today's two guest speakers exemplify that. We're very fortunate to have Mark Muro from the Brookings Metro and John Menhinick from the Oracle Corporation, both experts in how AI will affect the future of work. So let me introduce Mark. Mark is a senior fellow and policy director at the Brookings Metro, focusing on the interplay of technology, people, and place as they are altered by disruptions. In addition to a deep dive into Indiana's transitioning economy, Mark's most recent work has focused on the geography of the digital economy, including as it has been affected by COVID recession, and involves the diverging fortunes of superstar cities and places left behind. Current work with Mark explores the geography of the AI economy and inclusive technology, building on earlier reports such as what jobs are affected by AI, automation and artificial intelligence, how machines are affecting people and places, and the digitalization and the American workforce. Mark holds a degree from Harvard College and a master's degree in American Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. We're also very grateful to have John Menhinick with us today. And he is the Director of Product Management and Adaptive Intelligent Apps at Oracle. He is focused on consumer engagement via digital and data-driven media, including those that are programmatic in business development, commercial, planning and analytics, operations, and product disciplines. He holds degrees from the Ashcombe School in Dorking, UK, and the Royal Russell School in Croydon, UK. So we're very pleased to have both of our experts with us today. And I think as we look at the issue in large, in a global perspective, we see two things that are of great interest and potentially concern for us. One is there's a recent study from Oxford University. Carl Frey and his colleagues found that they looked at the US labor market, and they found that at least 47%, roughly half of all the jobs in the US have at least some components of the work which can be automated. So as we have our discussions today, we'll be looking at some of the concerns. Will we be displacing workers with the advance of AI technology? And there's another side to this, which is also of great interest to the business community. And that is, for instance, Andrew Ng from Stanford University released a report yesterday that indicates he believes that there will be approximately $10 trillion of value that can be added to the US economy over the next 10 years due to the addition, augmentation, and enhancement of work based on AI developments. So I think today one of the things I'm really excited to hear from our guest speakers is, one, what do we do with the issues of displacement of workers? How will that affect us in the future? And two, what are some of the concrete things we can do to try to grasp and marshal the developments of the burgeoning economy in this area? So at that, I would be delighted to hand it over to Mark as our first presenter, and getting some of his great ideas about AI and the future of work. Thank you, Mark.
Wonderful. Thanks, Charles, and thanks everybody for finding your way to the session today. What I thought I would do is help us get into the subject by providing a very brief synopsis of some recent work we've done, looking at what work will be most affected and who will be most effective. I'm not going to be too normative about whether these are complementary or substitutional relationships. For now, let's just talk about general exposure. There are a few surprises here, but at minimum, it'll give us a good, hopefully, a framework to start talking, to hear from John especially. For many people, the starting point in thinking about AI is the assumption that AI, like all forms or like other forms of automation, is going to be an issue mostly for the least skilled workers. That's the assumption. And you can see that here. In a 2019 report we did on basic automation, which was especially robotics and enterprise software, you could see that we said that the vulnerable would be the most vulnerable. And that is, we showed that the least educated and paid workers would be the ones most exposed to job disruption. We didn't say they would necessarily lose their jobs, but we suggested there would be a significant exposure. And the curve on the left there, or the right, shows this. The more a worker is paid, the fewer the tasks in her job were slated to be taken over by automation. Okay, so that's a sort of baseline. I think that's an intuitive view that many people have, especially of automation in the form of robotics, for instance. Conversely, the less someone was paid, say in fast food or retail, the greater the chances their job would be heavily disrupted, with the exception being care sector jobs. So you get the drift. The line chart here describes basic automation involvement declining as workers' wages go up. But now let's turn to AI, because I think that the situation here is much different. In our newer report, we focus on the labor market implications of AI specifically. And here the story is very different. With this study, we used AI to assess AI. By using machine learning to identify overlaps in the language of more than 16,000 AI patents and 800 plus occupational descriptions. So we're trying to see where there are matches of what a technology patent is promising to do and who is doing those things. This allowed us to cut through the vagueness and describe, as you can see, in the flow chart there, 8,000 verb, noun, word pairs that represent leading AI capabilities. So what do we find? Here you can see that we have something of an opposite finding. You can see that AI looks like it'll rise. AI involvement will rise with education levels and wages. Here you can see on the left-hand bars that jobs that require less than high school work, high school degree, or some college don't seem at this point to be slated to be heavily involved with AI. By contrast, in the right-hand bars, college and grad school professional degree positions will be highly affected, as you can see in the bars on the right. Relatedly, if we go to the next slide, you can see that the curve plotting AI involvement against wage percentiles now looked very different from the earlier curve we saw. Now it looks like the more you were paid, the more you will be involved with AI. That's exactly opposite from our earlier finding about robotics and basic automation. So it looks like the more that AI will be more a feature of the white collar office, really, than lower wage work. And sure enough, let's go to the next slide. You can map this onto specific occupations. In Cleveland specifically, and you can see that well-paid office and information workers and managers will be most involved with AI. In my view, we can speculate on this. John has some great ideas about this. I think AI enables computers there to approximate more white-collar activities, especially planning, prediction-based managing activities. such as carrying out or learning, reasoning, analysis, and decision making. But we can speculate on why that is. But here you can see very strong orientation to these professional activities. And let's go to the next slide. Let's look at industry mix. And here you can see, as one would predict, given the basic initial finding, that the density of professional and technical occupations in manufacturing, professional services, innovation, information, and management ensures those industries are the ones that are going to be most affected by AI adoption in the coming years. So those are a few findings that help us see that at least initially AI, let's go to the next slide, is more a question for white-collar workers, white-collar professions, and managers than for low-skilled workers for the time being. What does this mean for workers and firms? First quick point is I think there's an opportunity here. It is easier to imagine that the human-machine interaction might be more complementary than it might be for lower skilled workers here. And you can think about that. It's much easier to imagine that professional workers' involvement with AI would be beneficial and supportive to them and boost their productivity. And these are, after all, the most experienced workers, the most able to manage change with the most nimbleness from their education, and they're receiving high quality training from their employer. We know that training is not evenly dispersed. Companies invest in their better educated workers. So those are reasons that this could be a productive interaction. With that said, though, the questions posed by AI are, involving trust, transparency, the very power of the technology. I think raises very deep and potentially vexing questions that are going to challenge organizations like many of yours to begin significant journeys of deep and demanding learning. This isn't just a, superficial addition to the toolkit. This could be a profound new tool for organizations. So I think John is extremely well positioned to go farther with this discussion and think about the workplace. So I'm going to yield the chair here.
So hello, everybody. Against that backdrop, which I think really sets the scene for how AI may impact us all in varying degrees according to the type of roles we have in business, the kind of industries we're in. What type of AI are we actually talking about? And I thought it might be interesting to look at AI that's perhaps less well known. So not the famous innovations. So typically, of course, when we talk about AI, all sorts of things fill our minds. I'm hoping you can see my screen here. And of course, this makes it's great for the movie world, but it's a far cry from where we are in reality. The ways in which, of course, we've grown to engage with AI and to potentially enjoy its benefits, perhaps are better represented by some of the images on the screen. So you've got the autonomous car on the left. Please, by the way, keep your hands on the wheel at all times. They're not supposed to do that, but I suppose it shows the point there that we've got some autonomous features operating in a car. And of course, all mainstream manufacturers are doing this now to make it a safer experience. You've got things like satellite navigation from Waze using AI on its members in order to understand traffic flows and patterns. And of course, on the right-hand side here, we're showing digital assistants that have become an everyday experience for many of us. So we're not going to focus on those today. We're going to talk about the hidden gems, if you will, that exist in business and will impact and potentially complement the roles that we have that Mark was referring to. So just to ground us, though, on what we're talking about, we are still talking about features that subscribe to the same definition that we would typically associate with AI. So this is a behavior by a machine that would mimic human intelligence. And that might be a little arrogant if you were judging the intelligence of a species. And of course, you're looking at its ability to deploy sonar, for example, and perhaps dolphins will be cleverer than humans. But you get the idea. Anything that we would be associating with intelligence that a machine can deliver is probably derived from an AI outcome. And the disciplines that are encompassed by this AI definition, things like machine learning, which really is driving a lot of practical use of AI these days, and deep learning as well, where a whole network of algorithms can be put together to solve complex problems. You do come across, of course, the ability to interpret images and speech as part of AI usage. We'll focus more on the processing of structured data and unstructured data, and things like the classification of text in the examples we're going through today. So that's what we're going to focus on in this section, and look at everyday uses of AI in business. But what's all the fuss about? Why are we really so excited about AI and what it delivers? Well, the truth is that it's going to be the most disruptive technology, if you will, that we've seen for some time. And what it's going to allow us to do is to take all the data that exists in the world today and make sense of it, and make sense of it in a way that we've not been able to in the past. And what that will lead to is the ability for us to create new business models, to make existing business models more efficient, and deliver better products and services to customers, and better experiences for employees as well. That's something that's often underplayed, but it's certainly there. And I think those businesses that really embrace AI and leverage it in their workplace will do well, and those that don't are going to find it increasingly hard to compete. And there's a lot of data out there to get to grips with. Now, this was a pre-COVID collection of numbers, so forgive me, it's a little bit aged, but the order of magnitude you can see in front of you are huge. So whether it's 500 million tweets a day, 350 million uploads of photos to Facebook or Meta or whatever we're calling it these days, or whether it's the data that we collect through wearables and other sensors now. So 28 petabytes of data every single day. That's 1 and 15 zeros for those that are interested. And the prediction at one point from IDC was that we'd be generating around 460 exabytes of data every single day by 2025. And that's only around the corner. So that's 1 and 18 zeros. It's a phenomenal amount of information, which is why if we've generated this data and it's not going away, people and companies that can get on top of this information are going to be able to anticipate and meet the needs of the market more fully. But what can we do in terms of looking at just a few practical examples of how features developed using some of these techniques can be put to good use, both in the front of house section of a business where we're interacting more with customers, and behind the curtain in the sort of powerhouse that allows the organization to run in the back office as well. So what I've done very briefly is just have a look at a few examples in 4 areas of a business. I could have gone for anything here, but I've picked sales, service, finance, and HR, just to look at some practical examples so you get a feel for the ways in which businesses are already using AI. And of course, extrapolate that going forwards, you start to see how the world may change. So here's a very simple example in the world of sales. So imagine you're a salesperson and you're looking at a list of qualified opportunities in your computer on the right-hand side here, and you're wondering which opportunity to spend your time on. You want to invest your time in a way that's going to be most fruitful. And so wouldn't it be great if you had a best friend, an AI that could sit on your shoulder and help you understand which of these opportunities were going to convert into sales and become new profitable customers? Wouldn't that be great? Now, of course, salespeople may have their gut and their experience telling them which of these opportunities look more robust and look as though they might close, but they may not have that impression on every opportunity, and they may not be doing that in an objective manner. So what the AI is doing in this case is it's taking information on the company attributes, the stage in the pipeline, their interaction and transaction history, and converting that into a percentage score. So a likelihood that it's going to close in the next quarter. So it's a really nice, consistent and fully automated way that the salesperson can glean additional information and go about their role in a more productive manner. In addition to that, not only understanding what's likely to close, what if, and let me just zoom in here a second, what if we could actually tell the salesperson what actions they could take to expedite that close more quickly? So this will be provided in a narrative form saying, call your customer more frequently, or perhaps address the competitive threat, which is the example shown on screen. And what the AI is doing here is using supervised learning techniques, looking at previous examples of successfully converted sales and looking at the actions that were taken in the run up to that, and then comparing that to the current opportunity. So it's able to surface these recommendations in the software that the salesperson's using every day. So a nice, practical way in which the AI and the existing sales team can work together. And of course, this hunger for information and the ability to get advice on what to do next doesn't just apply to sales. I mentioned we'd look at other areas of a business as well. So I've put an example up here for service. And in many ways in service, it's even more urgent to have the right answer to hand because, of course, you've got a customer with a problem who's contacting you, perhaps dialing into a call center or through email or other channel of choice. And what the AI is doing here, again, being the sort of best friend to the customer service team, is providing them with a ranked list on the right-hand side of the image there of service requests that have come in previously and been resolved quite successfully using a particular approach, a particular resolution to that problem. So rather than the customer service agent having to initiate another query, another search into the database to be able to find what might be suitable as an answer, they've got the information surfaced right there. So part of this is being able to provide, intelligence just in that moment when it's needed and enable people to expedite their workflows more productively. And this goes for a whole range of tasks, including some rather mundane ones. So if we move into finance now, and look, if I just enlarge that, we'll look at what happens when you receive an invoice. And when you receive an invoice, the business needs to know who that invoice is from, what account it should be mapped to, and so on and so forth. And so inputting this account combination code is vital. But of course, being an accounts payable clerk who's majored in business and finance, you probably don't want to spend your entire life inputting codes. So wouldn't it be great if you had a best friend that could input it for you? And what the AI is doing here, again, it's a supervised learning technique that's looking at previously successfully allocated codes in order to generate the code for this particular invoice and pre-populate it on behalf of the accounts payable clerk, which is a massive boost to the finance team because I think it was McKinsey a couple of years ago did a study that showed that 36% of an account payable clerk's time is spent inputting codes like this. And it's a long code with an established naming convention and not something that humans are really designed to be able to do time and again without any error at all. But of course, it is something that the AI can tackle at scale much more effectively. But instead of just streamlining existing processes, what the AI can allow us to do is to engage in new activities as well. So in this example, the first image, the graph there on the left-hand graph, is showing you how a typical discount program would work with your supply base. And what we're saying here is if you're on a net 30-day deal and you pay the invoice after 10 days or within 10 days, you'll get a 2% discount. Great. But that's the sort of program that, say, one-size-fits-all approach. What if you could use AI and a data-driven approach to this problem? What you could do is invoke a tailored or dynamic discounting program with each of your suppliers that shows that if you pay within 10 days, that top orange triangle comes into play and you would receive a bigger discount. And if you pay after the 10 days, but still more than twice as fast as you're required to pay, you should get some benefit for that as well. What this enables you to do, of course, I know the savings look relatively small here in percentage terms, but if you annualize those, of course, they turn into much bigger numbers. And those numbers, that rate of return will far outstrip what you would expect to get in terms of interest for cash in bank. So it helps you maximize your working capital. And for your suppliers who depend on cash flow in order to survive, of course, you're paying them cash much earlier, and that greases the wheels of that relationship as well. The last area I thought we'd look at would be in HR, because of course we've all been in jobs or hoping to get into jobs. And so this process of applying for a job or a career move is familiar to us all. And so in this example, let me just blow that up a little bit. If we were to search for a particular role with an organization through their website, then wouldn't it be great if rather than just getting a binary answer or just the job that we've searched on through an exact match, we could use AI to interrogate the competencies and skill requirements for a given role and offer up similar jobs which may appeal to us. So not just based on the title, but based on the requirements in order to excel at that role. Second thing that companies sometimes ask you to do is to upload your resume. And if we can, again, using AI to interrogate and classify the text using natural language processing within that resume, there's an opportunity for us to understand what skills and experience this individual has and to offer up some jobs that are recommended based on them being apparently qualified for that kind of a role. And then last example for us today is one that we're probably quite familiar with, where hiring managers advertise for an open role. And then, of course, in days gone by, we'd have taken a highly manual approach to this, where you'd receive the applicant information, their resumes, and you would start to review them manually. And then some resumes would end up in the yes pile, some would end up in a no pile. But of course, the problem is these days, hundreds, if not thousands of applicants are applying for these roles. And even with a team of people, it is very difficult for a human being to sit down and give equal attention to every single resume and to understand whether resume number 75, for example, is better than resume number 47, and if so, by how much, and how does that affect resume number 50? It's very difficult for us to hold all these things in our minds. But the ability for AI, again, to use some natural language processing to interrogate the skills, education, and qualifications possessed by a candidate, and the level of match that that has with the competencies in a job requisition is something that AI finds quite straightforward. So this time now, in this era, using AI, every single applicant can have their resume assessed to the same level of detail with the same fastidious care, and have a chance of progressing towards an interview stage of a hiring process. So a really nice way to be able to complement the hiring team with clever use of AI for data. People often ask at this point, how do we get these capabilities? We've not got any. How do we start? In short, you can build or buy, like most things in life. Building can be done from the ground up, so using your commercial and data science expertise and your own infrastructure. Or what happens in some cases is businesses want to use their own skills, their own commercial and data science expertise, but they want to outsource the infrastructure bit because they've got their infrastructure designed for their core business and they don't really want to have to adapt that. And so making use of a vendor that's got an AI toolkit or a machine learning production pipeline is something that will be very helpful to them. So that's how you can build. And on the buy side, what many technology businesses are doing now is to fold in and embed pre-built, fully functional AI features into the software that they sell. So for common use cases, which we all may need to try and resolve and fulfill using AI, then there may be an opportunity for you to do that without the headache of any of the overhead associated with creating it or maintaining it, doing things like hyperparameter tuning or ensuring the models are recalibrating themselves, etc. That's all done for you. And so there's a way there for you to get started on your AI journey quite simply. I'll close out by saying that it really is a technology that if we embrace, I think businesses are going to really give themselves the best chance of operating in an ever more competitive environment. And those that put their head in the sand, I think, are going to struggle a little bit. Thank you, folks, and I'll hand it back.
Okay, thank you, John, and thank you, Mark. Boy, that was really interesting. Some very interesting insights. Give us a lot of food for thought here. Let me do some follow-up questions, if I might. For instance, given what we have talked about today, what are some of the issues we need to consider as we try to promote a value-added synergy between AI and human contributors in our business processes? So let me, as you're thinking about that question, let me illustrate with something we're really excited about that we're working on here at Cleveland State University. As an educator working in the information systems field, part of what I'm interested in is how do we help train our students as individualized as possible, sort of a bespoke education based on their interests and strengths, and help them be better prepared for the challenges that they'll face shortly in the labor market. So here's an example of what we're trying to do to synthesize and synergize AI into the educational processes here at CSU. One of the things we're doing is we're bringing in some large corporations. For instance, we'll be working with Ernst & Young in the fall, and they'll be giving our capstone course that I'll be teaching a design challenge. So part of what they'll do is give us contemporary business problems of significance. And then we'll be working on that for the semester to try to come up with interesting AI and information systems related solutions. In addition to that, the students will be working in an interdisciplinary environment, meaning that we'll have accounting students, we'll have information system students, we'll have business analysts, we'll have marketing, we'll have operations research groups, all working on the same problems from different perspectives. And finally, one of the things we'll be doing to integrate AI is, for instance, some large corporations, in fact, will be using some certification training opportunities that Oracle is providing in the area of their cloud database administration. So we're very excited that Oracle is providing both free training as well as free certification exams in their state-of-the-art opportunities and services, which our students will be learning. So as an example, the students will be asked what type of certifications make most sense for their future job scope of work. And they'll be working on that in addition to the design challenges we'll be working on together. And so what we're trying to do is synergize the best of the AI and helping to understand their skills and capabilities and the road forward, the pathway forward in achieving their employment goals. So in an educational sense, I feel very excited about those kinds of opportunities. Now, John and Mark, what do you think? What are some of the ways that we can better synergize AI into our field of work?
Sure. I could jump in with one thought, and John, I know, can elaborate in other directions, but I would say that I think a first threshold challenge for organizations is to bring a little more imagination and actually aspiration to the use of these technologies. It's not about just efficiency, which I think is the bugbear that has come to us from the understandings of automation. I think a lot of what the MIT economist Darren Acemoglu talks about, he talks about good AI and bad AI. Bad AI to him is purely a matter of substitution. It's an efficiency move to simply get rid of work in some way. And it doesn't really think about true productivity or innovation of processes. And so I would say that the automation view of AI is somehow reassuring. It's kind of cut and dried. We understand it, where the journey towards actual synergy is going to ask more of us, but maybe lead to more humane, better outcomes. So I think your education space example is a great one. It's about asking new questions, thinking creatively and empathetically. The embrace of different learning styles is the kind of thing that we can have infinite customization. In conveying and discerning emotion is another thing that I think we can bring to this. So I think that there's a lot of room here to move beyond simply efficiency to, a more powerful, deeper going and creative use. Another area I'll leave off with is with radiology, where the savings of time reading scans, and I think it's becoming quite clear that machines do a better job of that. The error rates have been plunging. But the field is not disappearing, it's actually growing because radiologists are doing higher value things. They're consulting with other physicians. They're going deeper in their thinking. They're becoming more deeply involved in radiological research, or doing more of what they find most fulfilling, spending time with patients and treatment teams and in imagining new approaches. So I think that's the real call to synergy that I think is the opportunity here, rather than the efficiency of simply bad AI. Let's embrace good AI. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I suppose I might not say that an efficiency introduced by AI was necessarily bad.
Right.
But I do agree. We have a habit, I think, of going for the sublime to the ridiculous sometimes. When new milestone technologies arrive, we all of a sudden start talking about how we can use it in its entirety to do everything. And then we tend to pare it back and we say, well, actually, what do we do that's really good at the moment? And is there something that we could do to make that slightly better? But moreover, and I like the point you started with, which is we need a good imagination for this. So we need to think, well, we've never attempted this before because that just we knew from the get-go wasn't feasible. But actually, if we really do have an ability to mine this data or to apply this technique or together with human intervention can achieve X, then why don't we think about doing that? Because it's been off the table so far. So I think the imagination is really important. And as regards to just pulling back a little bit from trying to do everything this way, as you say, and just sort of tunnel vision going down the efficiency route, we need to go forwards with a philosophy of doing things for, that are socially responsible and for the betterment of humankind and quality of life and what have you. Because if everything is underpinned by that, we'll always move in the right direction. And I think from a business perspective, we also need to think about when the use of AI is appropriate and when it isn't. So for example, there might be a business problem or a task which is adequate the way it is now, or something that can be achieved by an examination of some data and a simple set of rules. And there may not be any need for a sophisticated AI model in order to solve that problem. So one thing that we do a lot of is sit down with the business and say, right, what are you trying to do? Where are your pain points? And actually, is that the kind of pain points that AI can even solve? It might not be something that it can solve. And if it is, that's great, but is it a sledgehammer to crack a nut? And are we better off looking at a simple solution? Simple is always the best way. It's less overhead, it's easy to understand, it's more transparent. So let's go with that. So I think I agree with Mark entirely on the innovation side, on the imagination side rather. And I do think that some of the efficiencies will help some businesses that are currently struggling to rein in their cost base and be more nimble, give customers what they want more quickly. But yes, I do agree. I think we should be creating more than we're substituting. And I think if memory serves, the World Economic Forum envisioned that about 97 million jobs will be created as a result of the next wave of AI innovation, and about 85 million will be lost along the way. So overall, it was a net positive outlook. So those are my initial thoughts. I hope they help.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, John. That was really good. And I really was interested in what you were saying about the social impact of AI and the future of work. For instance, here's another question maybe we can consider. What are some of the ways that we can promote fairness as we integrate AI tools into our business processes? So I know that's a very important issue. There's legislation that's being developed both in the United States and the UK and the European Union, and then looking at that very specific issues. What are the risk factors that become emergent as we integrate AI into our business processes? So John or Mark, what would you think about something like that, those kinds of issues?
Do you want me to make some initial comments?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sounds
okay.
good. Excellent. Awesome.
I think we have to pay attention with what problem we're trying to resolve and what task we're trying to undertake, and make sure that any of the raw material we put into any AI models is suitable for its purpose. We need to make sure we don't introduce or propagate any bias, of course. We need to make sure that the way we want to process the work and trade going forwards is either consistent with the way it is now, or that there are changes we take into account. Because of course, we also have to be honest. So a lot of people will say, well, that would be great to use AI, but I'd really rather a person did it. But we have to be honest and look in the mirror and say, well, how perfect or how flawed is the current manual process? What unconscious bias do we have? What limitations do we have in undertaking this task ourselves? And then address it as a whole, rather than just looking to swap out some elements and expecting, a magnificent result. We have to make sure that we're approaching this, as I say, with a philosophy of fairness. And you've already mentioned, I think, Mark, trust and transparency as well. So, we really do have to make sure that we're looking at things in the round and focus on the data that we're using in these models, because it is a case of whatever data we put in, not just the individual attributes, but the origins of the data, the context of that data. We have to make sure that it's reflective of what we're trying to achieve, and we don't, fall foul of any inherent biases in that data in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Excellent points. Mark, what would you think about that? Some of those.
Yeah, I might add one thought. I think fairness in our tools, in our data, and how they're utilized is clearly going to require fairness and inclusion of the people in these teams. And I think this is a great challenge, where we know that, top AI talent is a very narrow community worldwide. So I think we have an important, technology diffusion and education problem ahead of us, a real challenge to make sure that we have, a diverse set of people and perspectives in positions of authority as well, implementing these technologies. I think we'll have better outcomes. I think we've seen some of the problems in big tech when you don't have that, and that can lead to tensions or distrust. So I think that making sure that AI teams in our organizations actually represent a diverse array of viewpoints is very important, and that's going to require a lot of education work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think for me, that's a source of pride as far as trying to promote inclusion in the educational process. Cleveland State University is an urban educational environment that we work in. And I'm very happy to see the kinds of diversity that we see every day in the classroom. And part of my charge is, how can I promote that? How can I help the human potential that I see before me develop in the very best way possible? And it is in the interest of machine learning and looking at those kinds of things. And I agree with you, Mark. I think the more diverse our teams are that work on these kinds of issues, the better the overall outcomes will be ultimately as far as fairness. And I think that's I think it's an excellent point, and that was really good. I think, John, too, you mentioned some really good points. In some ways, we're only as good as the data that we have to work with. And I know that the AI that's trained on, let's say, Twitter feeds or other social interactions, which has systemic racism or overt racism in it, can be disastrous. I know that Microsoft developed a chatbot. They trained it on the internet. They trained it on Twitter feeds. And unfortunately, it learned to be an incorrigible racist. And they had to take it down within a day because the things that it was providing for the discussion just weren't helpful. So we're only as good as our data, and we're only as good as the people that help to coalesce and marshal that data for the greater good. Now, here's our third and final question, follow-up question. What are some of the strategies that we can promote? I know, Mark, you had mentioned some issues of transparency and so forth. So what are some of the strategies that we can promote for transparency and to instill confidence in our outcomes as we integrate AI into our business processes? So Mark or John, any ideas on that? How can we try to promote transparency, which sometimes into a process which is often considered like a black box? We have an AI giving us results. We think it's pretty good as far as predictive value, but as far as understanding how it came about, that process can be clouded in mystery. So what do you guys think about that? How should we go about trying to promote transparency in this process?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the fact is that people are going to have to develop a methodology for doing that pretty fast, because a lot of the emerging legislation is insisting on it. Good old human race, when we're pressured in that way and have to do it in order to trade, we'll find a way to do it. I can give you some examples of how we typically think about it. There is we've already referred to, a lot of attention given to the data that we're using. And as I said, not just the origin or the attribute, but also the context. So when we're using techniques like natural language processing, we're looking at words that come before and after a keyword to understand its context. We're also zoning in on data that that omits anything that would promote the lack of fairness that we referred to earlier. So we are zoning in on skills and qualifications, and not age, ethnicity, religion, location, etc., etc. So that's part of understanding. The reason I bring that up again is because part of the understanding of how you got to an outcome might be focusing on the origins and the specification of the data that you used. So I think that, plus a combination of understanding at which points an automated decision is made and being able to reveal the process by which that's been done, so that you have kind of an end-to-end audit is a way in which you will breed confidence and a demonstration of that transparency. Another way is something that we introduced a while back, which is the introduction of supervisory controls. So that if there are certain parameters that can be controlled or weighted by the customer, then they can do that. So it's more applicable to their business situation. So I'm talking about a B2B solution that's been, perhaps used to deploy a new activity or automate one, then you'd be able to change the controls there. But the end-to-end audit, I think, is a great way to be able to do it. And you need to conduct those audits regularly, because it might be that your AI solution was great at one point in time, but it needs to consistently, over time, prove itself to be accurate and fit for purpose. And I think the way that the legislations are talking about this now is going to mean that annual audits are the norm. And this is both with legislation coming out in New York, in Washington. I think there's a consultation being done by the Senate. In Europe, we've got the AI Act being put together by the EU. And actually, there's a framework to help businesses get to grips with a lot of this legislation being put together in Germany by the BSI organization over there. And they've literally created a modular framework to allow you to get certified and show that you've achieved the highest standards with these AI solutions. And I think the legislation, the frameworks, the auditability of the solutions that get provided, I think we're in a reasonable place for providing that much needed reassurance to customers and whether they're businesses or individuals.
Yeah.
Excellent points. Excellent points. Thank you. Mark, what interesting ideas do you have here for us?
Yeah, that's very much where I was heading. I'm glad I let John explain it better than I would. But I think we shouldn't also think that this is somehow, a strange big government approach or a big oversight approach. This is absolutely necessary. We've done it before throughout, history and technology history, especially when we have sensitive industries and marketplaces where failure can have significant, consequences. Whether it's aerospace applications or metallurgy or manufacturing, we have large numbers of these kind of both auditing approaches and then tied, as John said, to broad certification. We need that signaling to close the loop on talent, on confidence, right? So you need that orbit. And, I think of things like, the Energy Star ratings in the past in the United States, have been attributed, and have driven a lot of beneficial consumer confidence and movement towards, green appliances and so on. So I really do like the link of the auditing function to a certification with a broad signaling seems very important here. Given the potential, we know that the last 5 years have seen, a lot of backlash towards, sketchy advertising-oriented business models in big tech and so on. And we know that can harm the direction of a technology. So I really like what John is discussing here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I know part of my research is sort of on this area, how to identify, assess, and mitigate bias in a variety of forms, whether it's born out of the human aspects or a technical aspect. How do you try to mitigate some of those issues? And I see this broadly in a couple different ways. For instance, there are great concerns about the black box nature of some of these issues, and it pops up in a surprising number of different ways. For instance, part of my sponsorship or part of the people that I work with for my research are national security. And they indicate to me, and they say, well, if we're going to take an action, if we're going to keep someone from getting on a plane, for instance, we have to have a better explanation than the AI told us so. We have to be able to reason what were the indicators, what were the rationale that we can bring to bear to make a safe and prudential decision in that regard. So that would be one illustration. Another is more positive in the sense that I'm working with some large pharmaceutical companies, and part of what they're doing currently is they're looking at how to automate the lab process. How can they use AI in the process of generating new molecules or synthesizing new molecules and for beneficial effect? And part of what the boon is here, and we're looking at this currently, this is sort of the state of the art of what my research is at, is how do we assess the improvements in reliability, replicability, and validity, if we can establish that, based on a lab where any researcher can use the exact same AI and computers and systems to try to generate or replicate the same kinds of outcomes. So those would be some of the things. There are great challenges, but also there may be great opportunities to promote fairness and transparencies in these processes, which I think is totally interesting. So that was fantastic. Both John and Mark, that was really interesting discussions. So I'm very grateful for your input here. We do have a couple questions coming in from our audience here. One of which, let me see if I can sort of summarize it like this. And John, we had spoken earlier about Oracle, about making cost-effective decisions. Maybe the simpler is the more elegant and the more cost-effective way of going about something. So some of our questions coming in from the audience are, what are some of the benchmarks, or what would be some of the guiding posts that we can look at to decide this would be a solution that would be better handled with AI incorporated into it versus something that maybe would be better handled by a purely human approach? Any ideas as you're working with your clients, broadly speaking, about how we go about making that prudential judgment?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the good news on a lot of this, I think, is that some of the fundamentals remain the same, regardless of whether we're introducing AI or making another adjustment to a business. You know, the standard approach to business casing, whether it be a time and motion study or some simple calculations to understand when you unpack a process, what's involved, how many times we touch it, or how long it takes, we can translate that into a unit of currency that's meaningful to us. And that might be people hours, or it might be cost of delivering a certain product or service. And so when we're looking at what AI can do, we usually are working on an estimate with a customer to simulate, what would a 10% gain here be, or a 35% gain here be? What would it mean to you? And then so it's a standard business casing approach, really. And I mean, segueing slightly, actually, the point you made earlier on I found fascinating was the training element. With AI, what do we need to be telling people to qualify in or certify in? And the same approach goes there. Try not to think of it as a singular specialist area. So I don't know, an everyday analogy might be, think of a restaurant. You don't have to necessarily train to be a head chef. You could be a sous chef, a saucier, a sommelier, front of house. There's lots of things associated with the restaurant that you could qualify in to be part of that discipline. And the same goes for AI. You might want to be a chief data scientist. You might actually want to be a product manager. You might want to be a consultant who's sort of halfway between the two. So there's lots around that. And the same thing goes with business casing. So it's nothing that's necessarily specific to AI. It's just looking at the business value we can derive, and then obviously running through a standard business case planning process.
Superb. A lot to think about. Totally interesting. As I'm really enjoying our conversation here. Super interesting stuff. Mark, do you have any ideas to add there as well?
I think John has really said it. I mean, I think moving to these synergistic combined solutions that are often going to be human supported, that will allow humans to do a better job doing what they do well, which I think is often empathy, creative response, strategic decisions made in context can't always be made by machines. And I think if we play this right, we can have a better human culture and business world, where the machines are quietly doing their best to to do away with you know, scut work and business and allow much more thoughtful three-dimensional problem solving by humans.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Mark, let me just have a follow-up question. I thought this is sort of interesting. Based on your research, looking at regions and how AI and technology impact whether a region can thrive or maybe it's falling back. How do you see the impact of AI, for instance, on those kinds of issues and sort of your macroeconomic perspective? What kind of lessons can we learn as, say, Cleveland in the Midwest here? What could we learn from that?
This is a hugely important point. We just have new research out yesterday. It's in the Wall Street Journal, page 2, on the geography of tech, which follows up the work we did on the geography in the United States of AI. And one problem that we face is that it's no surprise that if you look at, you know, a group of metrics of AI development and innovation, research, and so on, we're again developing a very narrow map of, you know, an expected short list of often coastal superstar cities, you know, that completely dominate, you know, the research flows and so on. So a problem would be if we have a very narrowly based AI sector in America with diffusion occurring very slowly into new places, but that the same places, Seattle, the Bay Area, New York, maybe Washington, D.C., you know, completely dominate creativity. That's not good for the United States, not good for the industry, and it would lead to, I think, disparities. And some companies in some lagging regions may not have full access to these technologies. You know, you could say that's an inevitable outcome, but, you know, we have been suggesting that the government needs to, say, invest heavily in new investments in especially universities in the heartland, for instance, to try to spread this out a little bit. I think the UK is trying to do some of this as well, making sure that we're not lapsing into path dependencies driven by the early mover, you know, first mover advantage. So I do think there's an important geographical issue here.
Okay. And I think we have approximately 60 seconds left here. So thank you both, Mark and John. I think it was terribly enlightening. I'm super grateful for your presence, for your being at the cutting edge of your fields and helping us think about these things more deeply in a sort of an overview sort of way as well. And the last thing I would like to say, as part of the conversation here, is we will have another Cornerstone Speaker Series on Thursday, April 14th. And we look at the topic of inflation and the impact on business. And unfortunately, that's an issue we're going to be dealing with, I think, for a little while here at least. So thank you again, Mark and John, for your contributions. It was terribly fascinating what you had to say. I'd like to go on for hours, but we'll have to respect your time here. But thank you again so much for your participation. It was totally interesting. And thank you very much for those who joined us today and being part of the conversation. So thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you next time on the 14th.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.